Hello everybody and welcome to my channel. So back in April of 2020 I did a video on Bionicle comics, and ever since then I've just been obsessed with Bionicle again. I've been obsessed with the lore, I've been obsessed with the characters, the toys, just everything about it. In all honesty, it's embarrassingly unhealthy. But there was one thing about Bionicle that has always kind of just been there that I've never really taken a part of, and that was the Bionicle chapter books. I did not get all of my Bionicle knowledge from the chapter books. That was almost all from the comics that I read. And as a kid, I wasn't the best reader, but it was something I always wanted to do. I always wanted to just read through the entire series. So that's what I decided to do. So to read them all, I actually did not buy like physical copies of these books. Instead, I used a site called Biomedia Project, which had scans of every single Bionicle chapter book. Is that legal? I don't know. The thing with Lego is they don't really seem to care much about Bionicle anymore, so I don't think they really care if someone copies scans of their old books, especially because they're not even making money off of these books anymore. But the original chapter books consist of 32 books total. I did not finish reading all of the serials. I am still making my way through them. I'm about halfway done. So I decided it is time to do yet another video that will only appeal to a very niche crowd. And that is why today I'm going to be talking about all of the Bionicle books, just my overall thoughts on them. It's going to be a lot of rambling with no clear direction, so let's begin. So Bionicle Chronicles is what I would call the first arc of Bionicle. It consisted of 4 main books and 1 movie novelization. So this is the part of the series that followed the Toa Mata, who would later go on to become the Toa Nuva, and it was written by C.A. Hapka. The first 3 at least. There was one written by Greg Farshtey. As you can tell with the first couple of Bionicle books is they were still figuring things out. C.A. Hapka's writing was a lot closer to what you've come to expect from children's books. Her books were really all about teamwork and working together. It's kind of what you'd expect from a Lego property, that or a team-up superhero movie. But every time that the Toa got together, they would just end up splitting up again, like with every book, and it just got really old and kind of frustrating after a while. I'd say that the first 3 books were very repetitive. Not bad. There is some stuff I like about them, but for the most part, they're just very repetitive. Now, Greg Farshtey took over when the 4th book came out, Tales of the Masks. This book is more of a Bionicle anthology where it follows each of the characters, each of the Toa Nuva on like a separate journey, and I think that works really well with Bionicle. Now, with Greg Farshtey, the writing isn't always great, but I think it feels more personable when I read his writing. It feels more like he's someone with his own idea of what the Bionicle world should be. C.A. Hapka's writing felt more like, here's a layout of what we want you to write, now write it. As far as movie novelizations, I only read the first one, and then after that, I decided to just watch all of the Bionicle movies again. To my understanding, the novelizations of Web of Shadows and The Legend Reborn both have a few things that are added to them that weren't in the movies. And I know people are gonna hate me for this because I know everyone who loves Bionicle loves those movies, but I am not a big fan of them. I think that they're very sloppy and they just try very hard to appeal to kids. Which I know Bionicle is made for children, but when you read like Greg Farshtey's writing, it doesn't feel like it's talking down to kids. Now, if you ask me, Bionicle Adventures is where things start to get really interesting. This gave Greg the chance to expand upon the mythology of Bionicle and kind of add his own twist to things. There's a lot of stories here that the comics did not cover at all, and for me that was very exciting because I got to read new Bionicle material. Both Voyage of Fear and The Maze of Shadows are 2 Bionicle chapter books that kind of cover the discovery of the island of Motunui. I like Voyage of Fear. I like the little story with Mavra and how he's hiding the Rahi. It just made the world of Bionicle feel more lived in to me. And that's what I love a lot about Greg Farshtey's writing. Like, obviously, I know he's not the best writer. He makes a lot of obvious mistakes, but he just has that love of fantasy writing that really invests me when I'm reading it because I too am a big fan of fantasy. Web of the Vizorak, Challenge of the Hordika, and Web of Shadows were the 3 books that followed the adventures of the Toa Metru after they turned into Hordika. I liked a lot of the stuff they did with this arc. I think I said in my comic video I wasn't a huge fan of this arc, but Here, there's a lot more done that the comics simply glanced over. I liked Vakama's arc a lot in this. I like that he is not fit to be a leader, and I just think that's a very interesting route to go when writing a children's book. I also think Rudaka was arguably the first good villain in Bionicle. Like there was Makuta. Makuta has always been there, but Makuta didn't actually become like a more fleshed out character till later. Rudaka, I think, was the first villain that I would say was actually a character. Now, Time Trap is one of the best Bionicle books. It is very good, and it's the first book, I think, in the series where I realized that Greg Farshty could tell a very good story when given that creative freedom. This was, believe it or not, even though it's a lot of people's favorite book, it was never covered in the comics, so it was all completely new to me. It follows Vakama on his quest to retrieve the Mask of Time, but it takes Vakama to an alternate reality where him and the other Toa never actually became Toa. Instead, some other Matoran became Toa. Of course, it does end up to be all part of an illusion, but either way, it's a very good twist on what we've come to expect from Bionicle at that point. This also had the introduction of the Shadowed One, who's just a really cool character that I really like. I like knowing that it's not just Makuta who's the main big bad. There's other villains out there that also hate Makuta. This is also where we get to see our first and possibly only hero-villain team-up in the Bionicle chapter books, where Makuta teams up with Vakama. It's also where we get to see Makuta become a more fleshed out character. Makuta Pterodax, to be more specific, because obviously there's a lot more Makutas introduced later on, but you know what I mean. But yeah, Time Trap was a pretty great Bionicle book. I really enjoyed that one. Now, Bionicle Legends was my all-time favorite arc. I love this so much. There are so many great elements in the chapter books for Legends that the comics never covered. At this point in the series was when Bionicle started to feel like it was less being written for kids and more being written for teens. It was very similar to Harry Potter in the sense that kids kind of grew up with the series, and as they matured, the series matured as well. There's of course still flaws in the writing, but I still really love it. This is the arc in Bionicle that starts with the Toa and Naika on Voya Nui, then moves to the Toa Mari on Mari Nui, and then moves to the Toa Nuva on Carta Nui. There sure is a lot of Nuis in Bionicle. But one of my favorite things about this arc is that it serves as the introduction to the Paraka, which I just really love the Paraka. I like that even though they could have just been like copies of one another, Greg decided to make each Paraka truly unique. You can tell that he had a lot of fun writing them. I think one of the things that Greg Farshty is very good at is writing likable villains, or villains you love to hate. We also get to see some of the Matoran from the past become Toa this time, which is just really cool. I love seeing that development in characters continue throughout the series. And I will honestly say the Toa and Naika made for much better heroes than the Toa Nuva ever did. I love Jawler. I love how he is just so prepared to be the leader of the Toa. Up till that point, we had like Toa Tahu, who was always angry, or we had Vakama, who never felt like he was supposed to be the leader. It's just great to see a character who's just willing to take charge and actually does a good job at it. Vaison is one of my all-time favorite characters in Bionicle. Not only does he make for an awesome toy, he's just a great character all around. Legacy of Evil may actually be my favorite of the Bionicle books. This is the one that just covers the Paraka's backstory, how they all came to know each other in the presence of the Shadowed One. Not only do we get to see the return of the Shadowed One, we also get to learn a lot more about the Dark Hunters. I think one-off stories that kind of further develop the world are some of my favorites. I just like seeing the world expanded upon. And of course, the Toa Knight can become the Toa Mari, and the Toa Mari half also has a very good example of that kind of story. We also get to learn a lot more from these books that I wasn't aware of from the comics. We get to learn a lot more about Mari Nui and how their ecosystem kind of works. We also get to learn about what happened to the Paraka. Spoilers, they were turned into sea snakes. I think Motoro's death, though, had about the same impact on me in the book as it did in the comic. The comic was a very good translation of that story. We also get to learn a little about what the Toa Nuva are doing during that time. Of course, they're on their own little quest to reawaken Mata Nui. Carta Nui is the final part of Legends, and it's where the arc for me takes a drastic turn. This is where they started introducing other Makuta, so the guy who was known as Makuta, now Makuta Pterodax. Now, I do dislike some aspects about this part of the arc. For one, I think the whole armor thing is kind of stupid, because they say that the Toa haven't evolved or anything. The reason they look different is because they're wearing new armor, but They just look so different from the figures that came before that I find it like really hard to believe. You really have to stretch your imagination on that one. Also, they introduced Toa Ignika, who is basically just the Mask of Life as a Toa. And this dude is OP. Like, he can just kill anyone with his mind, but they only ever use that like once. Also, Takanuva's story, they just kind of, they glance over really, because supposedly that story is told in the serials, but that's kind of annoying because I always wanted to know more about why Takanuva looks the way he does in that arc. You know, obviously I could just go read the serial, but I was just expecting that the chapter book would go into that a bit more. Plus, the final battle here does feel like a final battle. If it didn't end with Makuta winning, you could have convinced me that this was the end of Bionicle. Now, here we have an arc of Bionicle that often gets a lot of hate. This is Bionicle Glatorian. Now, there was actually only 2 books here that were published in the US. There was Raid on Volcanus and the movie novelization of The Legend Reborn. Now, The Crossing was actually meant to be like the first book for this arc. It was actually just put online as a serial in the US, but I think Poland had it published. I'm not sure why Poland gets these books published. Poland was also the only one to get a published version of Journey's End, which is the final Bionicle book. I don't know why Poland's getting all these books, but it truly was a Journey's End. I think the Glatorian stuff on Bara Magna feels a lot more rushed to me. There's a lot less time to kind of develop everything about the world. This is an example of some books where I like the characters a lot more than I like the plot. I love Gresh. Gresh is a great character, one of my favorite Bionicle characters. But a lot of the plot here is just them defending the town from bone hunters or delivering goods. Not very exciting stuff going on. I like the lack of Toa here. That's probably my favorite part about Glatorian. And I just like the fact that the Agori or the Glatorian can kind of break the mold. They're not split into heroes and villains. They can be whatever they choose to be. But even with that said, I think the story gets much more interesting once they introduce Matanui. The only problem is they introduce Matanui in the movie, and the movie is very bad. It's probably the worst Bionicle movie, but I still liked the character of Matanui. I think the movie did him justice. It just kind of did a lot of the other side characters a lot of injustice. Everyone's voice in that movie just feels like off, like they miscast almost everyone. The final book of Bionicle Journey's End is one that feels super rushed. I think the novelization or online serial for Journey's End was a lot more interesting than the comics made it to be. But even with that said, there's still a lot about it that I dislike. I really hate how the stars redesigns are not integrated into the story. The only character who they actually like mention changing back to like a smaller version of themselves is Tahu. Then you got characters like Gresh, who looks different in the stars line, but they never mention him having any sort of like evolution or change in the book. Or what about like the Skrull? The Skrull all look like bone hunters now, and it's like, why? That's more of a complaint about LEGO just like rushing the end of Bionicle though than it is the story, because I think that Greg kind of did the best he could with what he had. Even then, I will say that the final chapter of Bionicle just really got to me. It was quite a journey to read all these books like all the way through, and just to get to that ending was like a really satisfying, really good feeling. There's no way I could have read all these books as a kid. I'm sure a lot of kids could have easily read them all, but not me. But Glatorian, I think, was like a very good start to expanding the world of Bionicle. You know, it had its flaws, but the problem was that Bionicle was just cut too short. It ended way too soon. You know, other than the fact that it ran for like 10 years, which is like exceptionally good for a LEGO product. But yeah, this was an experience reading all these books. I learned a lot about Bionicle's story that I did not know before. I just loved seeing this lore be expanded upon. I loved learning about all these characters who I did not know exist until I read these books. Will Bionicle return someday? Probably not, but it's still something that brings me a lot of happiness, and the fact that it exists at all is something I can appreciate. So thank you to everyone who watched this video. Please, if you enjoyed it, like, subscribe, share it, do whatever you want to do. I'm trying to help my channel kind of get out there and have more people see it, so any sort of help is very much appreciated. I loved talking about Bionicle. It's something I wish I could do more often, but thank you all again, and goodbye.